The problem with recent history is to establish a perspective. If we look too closely at detail, we're entirely unaware of the surroundings. In global history, as in our view of the world, it's only when events retreat into the past that we can begin to recognize their context. But if they get too far away, we can distinguish very little. From 1 light year out into space, we can just see the sun, but not the Earth. From 10 light years away, even the sun is undetectable. So if we want to make sense of the very recent past, we have to establish a perspective which will allow us to omit the mass of detail which we think is insignificant, and so reveal what we believe is important. And as time passes, what seemed significant will change, and the perspective will shift. Individuals will be forgotten. Yesterday's triumphs will lose their meaning. Revolutions will come and go. This survey of the last 40 years will use today's most pressing issues as a key to interpreting and remembering the recent past. When John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin in 1961, his rapturous reception emphasized the symbolic importance of the divided city. Since 1948, when the Russians had attempted to take over West Berlin, America and its allies had protected and provisioned it. The city, deep in the Russian zone of occupation, would have been starved into submission if it had not been for the Berlin airlift. West Berlin became a focal point for the Cold War, as President Kennedy emphasized.
There are some who say, in Europe and elsewhere, we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin.
The Russians and the Americans were established rivals by 1961. But in 1945, the Americans and the Russians had met as allies on the Elbe River and had partitioned Germany into zones of occupation. These zones became the communist and non-communist Germanies, which are still in existence. Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader, set up satellite states with communist governments all over Europe, wherever Russian troops had penetrated. Winston Churchill coined the phrase "an iron curtain" to describe how the Russians closed off their satellite states in Central Europe and elsewhere. As recently as 1979, Russia moved south into Afghanistan to take over another buffer state. Russian imperialism survived Stalin's death in 1953. His successors seemed much more likable, but in Hungary in 1956, Russia put down the first major revolt amongst its Central European satellites with brutal efficiency. This was particularly surprising because Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia had been able to take an independent communist line since 1948. The 1956 revolt in Hungary was just the first of several occasions when the Russians repressed signs of independence in the satellite states. Hungary confirmed the worst suspicions of cold warriors such as John Foster Dulles, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and Richard Nixon, who confronted Khrushchev at the World Fair in 1960. These men shaped post-war American strategy, which concentrated on surrounding the communists with allies and strategic military bases in Asia, Europe, and North America. In Vietnam, the French and then the Americans fought from 1946 to 1975 to prevent the takeover of South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese communists. The American presence in Asia was part of a sustained attempt to combat communism in the decolonized parts of the world. Between 1930 and 1980, more than 80 new countries achieved independence. The superpowers played little part in most of their struggles. Japanese military successes had humiliated the Europeans during the Second World War, and this was one of the factors that fed the general urge to win independence. British India was emancipated in 1947 and led the way for other territories. Most British colonies in Africa came to independence complete with all a panoply of new stamps, new flags, national costumes, and the presence of a member of the British royal family at the Independence Day celebrations. There were few violent clashes. Elsewhere in Africa, the French and the Belgians at first resisted nationalist movements in their territories. French Algeria was rich in oil. The French settlers made it as difficult as possible for France to abandon sovereignty. In Asia, especially in Korea, the struggles for independence became highly politicized, as these contrasting posters suggest. The Korean War in the early 1950s was a manifestation of the global struggle, the Cold War. United Nations forces, led by the Americans, fought off the invasion of South Korea by communists from the north. The communists were never defeated, but they were kept at bay. In 1953, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel and has remained so to this day. This sort of stalemate and compromise is what America aimed at in Vietnam, to prevent the communists from advancing, to preclude the so-called domino effect. Despite the might of the American military machine, it was unable, in the end, to prevent the North Vietnamese communists from overrunning the South. The war against the Viet Cong that the French had abandoned in 1954 was eventually lost by the Americans in 1975. Nothing had been gained by America's attempts to withstand the combined forces of vigorous nationalism and communism. Roman Vishniak's photographs are a permanent record of Jewish culture in Central Europe during the 1930s. It was a culture that Hitler and the Nazis attempted to eliminate. After the Second World War, there was enormous pressure amongst Jewish survivors to emigrate to their original homeland, to Palestine. For a Jew to return to Jerusalem is as significant as for a Muslim to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Immigrants flooded into Palestine, and the British, who governed the area on behalf of the United Nations, attempted to stop them. Some Jews were interned in Cyprus, and there were violent protests. After all, the Middle East was dominated by Muslim and Arab states, which were utterly opposed to the idea of mass Jewish immigration to the Holy Land. When the Jews overcame British resistance and poured into Palestine, they attacked and were attacked by the Palestinian Arabs. They built the State of Israel with guns on their backs and with a 24-hour guard on their farms and their children. When the British left Palestine, the Jewish state was tiny. The State of Israel, which came into existence after a civil war in 1948, was only fractionally bigger. In 1967, the Israelis attacked the Egyptian and Jordanian forces. Israel reached the Suez Canal and established borders which gave it greater military and strategic security. Israel's leading general was filmed at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem to celebrate the victory. Israel had humiliated Nasser and defeated the Egyptian army completely. The Sinai Desert was littered with abandoned tanks and guns. Israel's new western border was the Suez Canal. But the Israelis were prevailed upon to surrender much of their new territory by the Camp David Agreement in 1978, and Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights continue to be disputed by the Israelis and their neighbors Jordan and Syria. Another threat to Israel is the Palestine Liberation Organization, a militia made up of people driven from their homes as a result of the creation of the State of Israel. Territories close to Israel, such as the Lebanon, became infested with PLO bases, and Israel chose to carry the war into those territories. The Middle East is still a flashpoint for nationalism and a focus for the Cold War. The history of China in the late 20th century has largely been shaped by the personality of Mao Zedong, who led the fight against the nationalists and Japanese between 1930 and 1949 and presided over the imposition of communism on the vast Chinese population. At first, Mao's China seemed the close ally of its communist neighbor, the USSR, but Mao's personality made him an unsubservient comrade, and in 1960 he took China on an independent course. Mao's dominance in China created unbearable strains. The disorders of the Cultural Revolution, when the Red Guards were encouraged to dismantle Chinese bureaucracy in Mao's name, set China back both economically and politically. The Russians attacked Mao on film, in print, and in other ways for his hysterical cult of personality and his deviance from their Marxist-Leninist line. Since Mao's death, his successors have found no formula to replace his charisma. China's persistent aspiration is towards the recovery of a unique Chinese way, Tao. The Chinese look forward to an eventual return to the prosperous certainties of the Middle Kingdom. Revolutionary Maoism aimed to become a beacon for the masses of the world and to relegate both capitalism and Soviet socialism to the scrap heap of history. But in spite of his intentions, Mao's reign began to resemble that of one of the Chinese emperors whom he and the communist government had replaced. In 1961, American spy planes detected Russian missile sites being built on the island of Cuba. Russia had acquired the atomic bomb in 1949, and to America's surprise, the hydrogen bomb in 1951. In Moscow, ever since the late 1940s, Soviet leaders had paraded their increasing armories of long-range and medium-range guided missiles to publicize Russia's strength. These missiles supplemented an immense and well-equipped conventional army. Russia was a massive rival, ideologically, politically, and militarily, to the USA. Americans had grown used to the idea that Russia's long-range missiles could reach American targets over the North Pole, but the thought of short-range missiles, aimed at its heartland from Cuba in the immediate south, was more than America could tolerate. President Kennedy and his advisors took the decision to blockade Cuba from the sea to prevent Russian ships from delivering missiles.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The Cubans prepared for an invasion, and the world prepared for the worst. But Russia's attempt to try to outflank America was a failure. The blockade was successful, and the Russians turned back. The balance of terror remained undisturbed. There were 3 atom bombs in existence in 1945, one used for testing, the others dropped on Japanese cities. A published Western source suggests that by 1985, there were 8,410 intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering hydrogen bombs to targets thousands of miles away. There were also 7,877 rockets, almost as large, which could be fired from submarines. Some of these rockets carry several independently targeted bombs. There are 4,102 atomic or thermonuclear weapons which can be delivered by the fleets of bombers which are on alert night and day throughout the world. And in addition, short-range ballistic missiles, including cruise missiles, numbered 1,426 in 1985. The accuracy of figures about nuclear weapons is always debatable. The truth is kept secret. But the grand total is believed to exceed 20,000 high-yield atomic or thermonuclear weapons, as against 3 in 1945.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
That was the age of atomic innocence, when the dangers of nuclear radiation were ignored. Ships sailed into the atomic cloud, and sailors went on board blast-damaged vessels without protective clothing. In many places on Earth, even in 1985, the majority of the population live in small villages, use hand tools similar to those in use for thousands of years, and, like their ancestors, cultivate the land, grow simple crops, and look after animals. But village life is changing. The dissolution of this traditional rural life in the second half of the 20th century is a fundamental change in human affairs. Villages confront problems caused by rapid population growth in Africa, Asia, India, and Latin America. Revolutionary ideals and tensions have developed amongst those whose way of life has been distorted by the rise in population and impinged upon by the cities. The external pressures on tribal and village societies have politicized the world's peasantry. The characteristic image of modern life is of a peasant or an ex-peasant with a powerful gun. The world of today is a place of conflict and contrasts. New appetites need to be fed. If we look at the world geographically, it presents a familiar picture. The areas of the world's landmasses can be represented like this. Look now at China and India as the map changes to show the relative sizes of the various populations. Look at how Africa shrinks to nothing as the map changes again to show gross national product country by country. Rapid population growth in the Third World reflects the irony of medical successes since World War II. Fewer small children die of preventable diseases, more of starvation. Famine and drought are a consequence of land shortage and appalling poverty. They appear to be endemic and seem to worsen every year. Donald McCullen's pictures were taken in Africa. In the poorest areas of the world, the average annual income is much less than $1,000 per head. In these areas, it averages less than $6,000. Only in a handful of countries does average income exceed $6,000 per head. The poverty and distress amongst peasants and ex-peasants stimulates the growth of new ideas. Muslim fundamentalism in Iran and elsewhere has produced a new clash of ideologies. Between 1945 and 1975, America and Russia attempted to spread two supranational and secular systems of belief to all the countries of the world. But they failed. The new nations are going their own way and are attempting to frame their own vision of the world. Religion is often a part of that vision. In Iran and elsewhere, America and the USSR react as best they can to unfamiliar and powerful systems of belief. In October 1957, the Russians unexpectedly launched the first space satellite, the Sputnik. The Americans were left behind, and Sputnik 1 overflew American territory, transmitting signals back to Russia. Even after the first Sputnik had burned up in the atmosphere, Russia maintained its lead. In 1961, with an enormously powerful rocket, much bigger than anything the Americans had, the Russians launched a man into space. They sent a television camera with him. The pictures of Yuri Gagarin floating round the world in his space capsule were of immense political and propaganda significance. This was part of the revolution in communications, which had started after the war and had already made distant parts of the world accessible to everyone. Better communications changed the pattern of international politics. President Nixon visited China to meet Mao Zedong, and whether face-to-face or through the electronic media, the personalities of world leaders became as important as their policies. The revolution in communications affected culture, music and trade as much as politics. Pop music and pop musicians became international commodities. The Live Aid concerts in 1985 were transmitted to almost 2 billion people. Geosynchronous satellites, which can be maneuvered into chosen orbits around the world, make all this possible. They transmit information and ideas from place to place instantly in a way that has never previously been feasible. Computers control the satellites hovering above the globe and feed their own ravenous appetites for data on signals bounced back from space. Low-level satellites survey and photograph the world's surface to detect oil, minerals, and military movements with equal accuracy and facility. America's space shuttle and Russia's Soyuz missions have begun the conquest of space. Men now build and live where there is no air, no gravity. America's unique achievement was the first landing on the moon in 1969 and its subsequent exploration. The space missions have given us an astonishing knowledge of our surroundings and a striking command of our circumstances. But to accommodate traditional ways of life in a world which is changing so rapidly appears to be beyond our grasp. The old nomadic and rural patterns of life will not survive much longer. It is the future of the millions of displaced villagers, what they do and what is done to them, which is the most pressing of all the world's problems.